and to get caught up in the game of making trips, discoveries all over South Asia. We end up in Bali court. I am convinced that this is the place where we must live a new project, a new phase of our existence, not only family, but also professional. So I work for a large Swiss bank, which has put me in a program called graduate training. And in this program, I meet a young man who is a graduate of Cambridge named Raphael. And this Raphael's father happens to be a billionaire. When I moved to Hong Kong 6 years later, this friend Raphael regularly tells me, every time we talk on the phone, "Hey, it's called Dad. You know he's in Hong Kong regularly. He would be very happy to see you." And one thing leads to another. We start having monthly meetings at the peninsula to catch up. One thing leads to another, and we are also invited to dinner at his and his wife's place. Until one day, 2 years later, in the spring of 2006, returning from Bali with this project that excites us, my wife and I, of maybe going to live in Bali. During my monthly lunch with Charles, I talked to him about it. As soon as I mentioned the word villa in Bali, his eyes widened and he said to me, "But Matthias, I don't think we've ever talked about it. But for me, having a house in Bali has always been a dream. It's incredible." I had thought about it several times, but without anyone on site, it's unimaginable. So listen, you want to build a house there? Could you build one for me next to it? Because really, it would be a dream come true thanks to you. So I tell him, yes, we have started to look at the numbers a bit. In my opinion, it would cost about $1 million, maybe a little more. But well, we're talking about that kind of budget. No problem, I'll transfer the funds this afternoon. And then afterwards, you'll keep me updated. But really, it absolutely has to be done. I inadvertently find myself forming a group to construct homes in Bali. Charles phones me saying, "Okay, Matthias, I spoke with my billionaire friend, the Czech guy your age. As I plan to build a house next to yours in Bali, he wants the same. Call him and provide your account number, as he will also send you $1 million." And just like that, in half an hour, I already have 2 people who basically are sponsoring me to build houses in Bali next to mine. And in the following weeks, we find among our acquaintances 2 other people who tell us, yes, so if you're going to build and you're on site living there, we absolutely want you to build houses for us too. We were in absolute trust, so everything was done with a handshake. For the entire construction period of this project, which lasted 2 years, from the summer of 2006 to the summer of 2008, every month I would send them a very detailed report, written by email about what had happened. We arrived in August 2008, where we inaugurated these 5 villas and where the 4 sponsors were over the moon, delighted, happy, gave us gifts, thanked us warmly. My sponsors tell me, "Listen, Matthias, your house, we understand that you're going to put it up for vacation rental, that you're going to look for clients who will rent it by the week, the month, etc. Would you do the same for us?" By late 2008, we were managing 5 houses with 26 rooms total. With my wife, we now find ourselves managing a real estate complex. Everyone is extremely satisfied, no one is asking for accounts. The system works well in the sense that we are starting to have an occupancy rate that is reasonable. Of course, there is a ramp-up period, but we are therefore just balanced. But 2 of the sponsors decide to manage on their side. So I find myself for the year 2011 managing only 3 houses. In 2011, I found a buyer for my house, because the project, of course, was to build these houses, but for us, it was also to resell them, among other things, to make a profit, but also to move on to something else. I sell my house, so I am no longer a stakeholder in this group of 5 houses. I receive a very aggressive email from the famous Charles, and his son more precisely, who tells me, "Matthias, we suspect you of having overcharged us when you built the houses, so we go back 3.5 years, and so we immediately put you in default to give us the construction accounts of our houses otherwise," and then the sentence does not end. I am, upon receiving this email, extremely hurt by a situation which the day before was in fact monstrous capital gains, and the next day we switch from handshakes and reports that were essentially verbal to a system where all of a sudden you have to be extremely procedural and you have to display in a highly corrupt country impeccable accounting. Implicitly, of course, this email for me tells me, well, now we are entering a Western accounting system, so sorry, old man. Until now, it was verbal, but now we are changing the rules of the game. And I don't like it when the rules of the game are changed along the way, or even at the end of the game, or even after the end of the game. So to this email, I respond with a middle finger saying, I owe you nothing. I'm sorry. I've shown you that I've made huge profits for you. End of story. Maybe I should have told them, listen, this accounting, we have it done by an independent firm, which you choose, and then we move on to something else. But my character is, no, you trusted me, I delivered. Now all of a sudden you don't trust me anymore, nothing happens, and then everyone lives their life. And that's what triggered the descent into hell that followed. 3 or 4 very tense months for my ex-wife and me, wondering what these people want from us, why they are doing this to us. We have nothing to blame ourselves for, but at the same time we have nothing to do with them anymore. So, too bad. In a very, very circumstantial way, I try to go back into this complex, and there the guards at the entrance tell me, no, Matthias, you're not allowed to come in here. It's not your home anymore. No one is allowed, so really a kick in the butt. Traumatizing, but for me it's a bit of a sign that, well, life goes on, but we move on to something else. We agree that with these 4 sponsors, the relationship has become very tense. That's the way it is. Now, we live in Bali, we have other projects much less ambitious, and June 2012, my best friend celebrates his 40th birthday in Hong Kong. We board the plane without a care in the world, because when we arrived at customs in Hong Kong, our Hong Kong ID cards rang at immigration and we got arrested. And we were told that we were suspected of money laundering, misuse of corporate assets, and scamming people who have filed a complaint against you in Hong Kong. And so you are taken into custody. So we find ourselves in custody in Hong Kong. Neither my wife nor I had ever been in custody before. At the end of a weekend in custody, suddenly on Sunday evening, a prosecutor arrives at the police station. We are in custody. He tells us that we are charged and that we will appear before the judge tomorrow. Luckily, we had mobilized lawyers with help from our Hong Kong friends. Hong Kong is still where we lived for over 4 years. Our lawyer got us released on bail, and so we find ourselves indicted in Hong Kong. But released on bail means passport seized, so unable to travel, reported to the police every day to make sure we haven't flown off into the wild, knowing that we no longer have our passports, but still so ultra-restrictive measures, and then especially cutting us off from our life in Bali and our children. We had somewhat protected our backs financially, and when we left Hong Kong for Bali, we had said to ourselves, if ever things go wrong in Bali, it would be good to have a foothold. Hong Kong. So we had a foothold in Hong Kong where we find ourselves with my extra memory charged with having to prepare a criminal trial, of which we do not know the ins and outs yet, and where we ask ourselves, what do we do with our children? What is going to happen? Where things are extremely complex compared to what one might imagine in the Western world, is that here we are in a Hong Kong Chinese system. We are also in a system where one should not show their proofs. So very quickly, our lawyers tell us, if you have things to say, you will say them at the trial, but absolutely do not show anything before. While my ex-wife and I, we know full well that there are many things that theoretically are reprehensible, since there has been a lot of corruption, but this corruption has been validated by the plaintiffs, since now it's no longer sponsors, it's become plaintiffs, and so there has been extremely dense, fluid and transparent communication that we could show right away to relieve the pressure and reach a common ground. But our lawyers tell us, you are in criminal law. It's not these plaintiffs that you'll have to convince, it's the state of Hong Kong. So in this process, we show nothing at all until the trial begins. So we're entering a period of extreme tension. My wife rapidly becomes upset, claiming she only did the decoration and is not involved in the money issue. However, her involvement in this is one of the monstrosities of the case. It's one of the things that, for me, is the worst, meaning she was indicted. These people filed a complaint against me. Either we were in business, but against her, who was only the decorator, and incidentally my wife, it was a low blow of a monstrosity, of a pettiness, But I will never, 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 never forgive if they did that. These people did it to get to me and to force me to bend even more and finally give in to their demand. In parallel, and it's very, very painful because it's easy to tell once you've lived through all this, but when you're in the process, when you find yourself indicted and when your lawyers penalize you, so we immediately take, of course, the biggest lawyers, Golden Boy, so the means. So we take the best possible lawyers in Hong Kong who quickly explain to us that what we are accused of is punishable by 4 years in prison. And no matter what you say, but wait, this story, everything we are accused of, it happened in Indonesia, in Bali. We are Indonesian citizens, we are French, we have nothing to do with Hong Kong anymore. First discovery of the process, are the authorities of Hong Kong capable of putting us on trial like this? Is it justified? Our lawyers very quickly launch a motion saying, in fact, the authorities of Hong Kong, we believe they are not competent, they have nothing to do with this. Hong Kong authorities quickly responded, confirming their competence due to a money transfer between a Hong Kong account and an Indonesian Hong Kong account. But it's the first clue for us of whether this justice is really fair. Are we really in a trial where there is something that justifies all this story? And then there is a media hype. So not very, very strong, but still, all of a sudden, we learn that to prosecute us in another trial, it's a special prosecutor who comes specially from Australia who will prosecute us. It's not the usual prosecutors from the group of prosecutors in Hong Kong. That it's someone who costs very, very much? Well, why? And then thinking about it, because obviously with our lawyers we think a lot about this whole story, we discover that one of our sponsors, who is a billionaire, as I explained earlier, he is a member of the Legislative Committee of Hong Kong. So it's as if he was a deputy in France, a deputy in... well, of course, so all this, it's still a little among ourselves. And that means not only are we facing a mountain, but in addition, especially me, since after the complicity with my wife is unraveling and I start to think, we are not in something that is really fair and equitable. So how could we, as little French people, have a chance to assert our word, our side of the story against this steamroller? Since our lawyers make us understand that if these people withdrew their complaint, presumably this whole affair would end overnight. So in the summer of 2012, we take several actions with my ex-wife. The first is to set up an accounting system that can be shown to experts in order to validate and present it at our trial. And at the same time, we start trying to communicate with these people through our lawyers. Our enemies promptly informed us that if we pay them $2 million, they suggest everything would be resolved. A sum that comes from nowhere makes no sense and seems completely unjustified to us. So we refuse. We say, listen, in these cases, we let the procedure go. And in parallel, we also try to recover our passports. And in early September 2012, we have a hearing to which we present ourselves. And our lawyers for this hearing have asked to recover our 2 passports. So my wife and I, thinking, well, my wife, who is not really involved in this story, she should recover it easily. And then me, if I don't ask for it, my passport, obviously I won't get it back. So I might as well ask for it too. And the worst scenario happens. In other words, the judge enters the courtroom acknowledging the defendants need to reconnect with their family. So I'm going to issue a passport. And since there's a nanny who can take care of the kids, etc., I think the main problem is the business. So I'm issuing the gentleman's passport. And so here I am retrieving my passport, and there's my wife remaining hostage to these authorities. And that was the scenario we hadn't anticipated, and it's the beginning of the family drama where my wife is in Hong Kong and obviously blames the authorities, but also blames me for triggering this whole story. We wait a bit for things to happen. It lasts until the end of the year 2012, and then at the end of the year 2012, we finally decide to settle everyone in Hong Kong, to educate the children in Hong Kong. Thus, as a lover, my wife also recovers her passport. Our couple is falling apart because my wife can no longer stand this pressure and the idea of an upcoming trial. We no longer get along. At the start of 2013, we decided to separate. For the sake of our 3 children, we decided it would be better to separate while in France. So we are planning our return to France. We want for our family to flee this horror, this pressure. This will allow us to organize as a blended family, classic Parisian style. In parallel, my mom got very sick. She has terminal cancer, so the doctors let us know that she doesn't have very long. So in the summer of 2013, we returned to Paris. My children obviously need their parents in Paris. And in a month, my ex-wife and I have to go attend our criminal trial in Hong Kong, where a prosecutor says she's going to get me sentenced to 4 years in prison. So for me, the decision is very simple. If I have to be stuck in Hong Kong and my mom dies and my children are traumatized, life has no meaning. So we're going to do it the other way around, which is I'm not going to go to this trial. I took out insurance with the French authorities in the meantime, who told me, but in any case, we do not extradite our nationals. So if you stay in France, nothing can happen to you. So after that, you do what you want. And what I want is not to go there. So the day our trial opens, October 13th, 2013, I do not show up there. Our trial opens and the judge immediately seizes the monstrous bail that we had to put up to be released on bail, then to retrieve our respective passports. It's simple. These people are now fugitives, so I register them on the Interpol red notice. Overnight, my ex-wife and I found our names listed on Interpol.com alongside notorious criminals like Osama bin Laden and Pablo Escobar. All this over a matter of money. In Hong Kong, it's criminal and therefore it's 7 years in prison. So here we are dealing with issues of international law and differences in the treatment of offenses. So I am considered by the Hong Kong authorities as a fugitive, as well as my wife, with another Interpol, which means that if we leave French territory, we can get arrested, and then we don't know what will happen to us. My mother is on her deathbed and she passed away in July 2014. We are now a divorced family, classic French style, with holidays split between mom and dad. Still owning a house in Bali, which is the house where our children spent the first 6 years of their life, so it does leave a mark. In the summer of 2016, the kids told me they really wanted to go to the house in Bali because they missed it. A crazy idea comes to me, which is, what if we try to go back? Of course, I know there's my Interpol file. It's extremely risky, it's madness. But I also know that from the 6 years I spent in Bali, I have built up an extremely powerful support network, which I think I could call upon. I had participated in the election campaign of the governor of Bali, so he is the most powerful person on the island. In the purest system, we can say electoralist, we can say bribe, we can say corruption, but there you go. So now I was part of his group of obliged, and I allow myself to make a phone call not to this gentleman directly, but to people in his entourage who tell me, Matthias, if you want to come back to Bali, there is no problem. Of course, we support you that if ever there is the slightest problem at the airport, we will be there. So what you do is that you come with your children. You give us the arrival and departure dates. You take a little bit of cash on you. If ever there is a customs officer, an immigration officer that needs a little help, to be understanding, but don't worry. So with these guarantees, here I am with my 3 children under my arm, July 2016, coming to spend 2 weeks in Bali. And we go through immigration without any problem. We spend 2 dream weeks in our house and seeing friends, and it's extraordinary. And the kids are happy, and so am I. And we return to France without being worried either. Everything is going very well, everyone is happy. After spending these 2 wonderful weeks in Bali, in our house, in the summer of 2016, the repeat was 2017. As the holidays approached, my children tell me, Dad, we want to go back to the house. Can we go? And there, I tell them, yes, of course, like last year, without having listened to a small voice that, in the form of an internet message, had said in February 2017, our Interpol is meeting in Bali, and updates its computer system. Now, with a new computer and information system, Interpol is in Bali. I read the news but don't pay attention and end up forgetting it. So I take my kids under my arm again and I hand my passport to immigration and they start to ring. Suddenly, I'm surrounded by about 10 polite policemen who don't handcuff me, but instead say, you know, Matthias, there you go. You need to follow us to the office and bring your children. So very quickly I tell them, listen, we're going to call such and such as usual. And they tell me, yes, if you want Matthias, huh? But now, with the new computer system, the Interpol alert is already in Lyon at Interpol headquarters, and we won't be able to erase it from the system. The hours go by, we're at immigration, all four of us, and then at one point the children fall asleep, so I asked my driver to take them home, and then I didn't see them again, and I ended up in prison. They first put me in a center called a detention center, which isn't even a prison, which is a kind of huge basement room with very little daylight, and from which you don't get out, where in theory, the Indonesian authorities can only keep people for 60 days. I spent 7 months there. Then I spent another 2 years in Balinese prisons, exactly 25 months before being extradited. So those were the worst moments of my life, a kind of free fall to crash, I don't know where, to find myself in an environment surrounded by criminals who are all very nice, adorable. There is an incredible human solidarity. But in destitution and at the mercy of everything and having to ask for help constantly. For someone who, moreover, is used to being the one who helps and makes things work, suddenly things completely reverse. It's terrible. Terrible, terrible, terrible. The length of imprisonment was excessively long. Anyway, since it ended in acquittal, I should never have been imprisoned like that. The first thing is that you become completely numb. That is, the first months of incarceration, from August 2017 until November, the first 4 months, I see my life falling apart. So I had restarted my professional life in Paris, in France rather, and I had a big hotel project in the south of France, where I am originally from, in Rodez. And within 2 months, this thing is completely questioned, then cancelled, and the company is liquidated. In parallel, my children are in an impossible psychological state, so they saw their father get arrested, then they were repatriated to France by their mother's friends and family. But they suddenly find themselves living just with their mom. And then it's very complicated, so my son no longer goes to school, and then he even ends up in a psychiatric hospital. And my daughters are having trouble being schooled, especially the youngest one. And my wife does nothing but push my head even further underwater. Not only is she asking the family court judges for sole custody, which makes sense since I'm no longer there, but she's making completely outrageous financial demands. So when you find yourself in prison with no means of subsistence, and then to be hit like this financially, it's kind of like the icing on the cake, but in reverse. All of this happening at once, and on top of that, I'm trying very quickly to fight for my release because I believe all of this is completely unfair. So I refuse to be extradited to Hong Kong because that's actually what triggered the Interpol notice at the Bali airport. It's the Hong Kong authorities asking for you to be arrested to bring you back to Hong Kong, to put you on trial in Hong Kong. And I keep saying this trial will be unfair, not only because the charges are unfair and unjustified, and so I shouldn't be in this, but also because I think this trial will not be balanced. So for me, these are the double reasons why I fight as much as I can to be repatriated to France, and for the Indonesian authorities to agree to release me, knowing that the French authorities there are mobilized not to get me released, since they will again say that the Indonesian authorities are sovereign, but at least to listen to what I have to say, and possibly what I have to say will allow me to return to France. Aside from that, I'm imprisoned. We sleep directly on the floor. So quite quickly I get brought some kind of little foams like you find in kindergartens. To wash, there are 2 water holes that are vaguely hidden by walls and doors that hold as well as they can. Obviously it's cold water, we don't really know what quality it is. And I find myself surviving in there. And in parallel, we initiate a procedure with the UN for unlawful detention. The UN, through its working group in Hong Kong, first unofficially declares to my lawyers and to Indonesia that it will issue a report in the coming days where it will tell the Indonesian authorities that they must release me without delay because my detention is unlawful. Before this report is published, so 2 or 3 days pass, the Indonesian authorities call Hong Kong saying, if you want to retrieve Matthias Eschen before the UN forces us to release him, it's now or never. So the Hong Kong authorities rush things, send 2 policemen to Bali to retrieve me. The Indonesian authorities fully cooperate and sign all necessary documents. I find myself extradited and incarcerated in Hong Kong, awaiting trial. It's now September 2019. And from September 2019 to November 2020, I was incarcerated in Hong Kong under horrible conditions because there was no communication at all. The prisons are not corrupt at all, so no internet, no longer able to talk to my children, nor with my lawyers, except by letters. It goes on like this for 13 months, during which my former lawyers, superstars and extremely expensive from Hong Kong come back to see me saying, "Matthias, we will help you prepare your trial for the modest sum of $1 million. As I mentioned, my standard of living had decreased due to the problems created by these people. 8 years after the indictment of June 2012, I no longer have the same means and certainly not the means to pay $1 million for people who tell me that the outcome of the trial, that we cannot guarantee. Meanwhile, even without these lawyers, I have already asked several times to be released on bail. So, from my prison in Hong Kong, I send letters to judges saying, here, I would like to make a bail application because I need to prepare my trial under quite honorable conditions. There were 2 hearings like this, and during these 2 hearings, the judge said, "But how dare you ask to be released on bail? When you were released on bail 8 years ago, the first thing you did was flee. So you have a maximum risk of flight? No question." My trial, which is scheduled for November 2020, is approaching, and my lawyers are starting to say, "But we will never be ready. Your trial will not be fair, so we will request a hearing with the judge who will manage your trial, and then we will tell him that you absolutely must be released on bail, even if it is under very, very strict control conditions. We will ask." And here, I make a small parenthesis on the good deeds that followed all this drama, and there was one, in this case one named Patrick, who is a Frenchman who has lived in Asia for over 35 years and who decided through the support committees that had been set up around me to help me during all this horrible life of these years of incarceration. He decided to help me. And so this gentleman who lives in Hong Kong, one day in the summer of 2020, visits me in prison. And very quickly through the glass, because the visits to the parlor in Hong Kong, it's through a bulletproof glass with telephone combinations. So we don't hear the other's voice well. It's limited to 10 minutes, but very quickly he befriends me. He says to himself, "But this guy, I have to help him." He first visits me once a week, then after twice a week, he brings me books, he brings me food that is allowed in addition to the prison's ordinary. And then he says to me, "Listen, Matthias, I speak with your sisters, with your support committee. Tell me what we can do to help you." And very quickly we understand that it would be good to try to help me get released on bail. So he goes in support of my lawyer to attend the hearing that my lawyer gets with the bail judge. So this is at the end of October 2020, and the judge says, well, I understand, since it's a recurring request that he should be released on bail so that he can prepare his trial under good conditions, release Matthias Etienne on bail, so on condition that he puts money on bail again, that there is someone on site who is a citizen of Hong Kong, who vouches for him, who finds him a place to live not far from the trial, not far from the court, etc. So the judge puts a whole series of conditions on the table, and the famous Patrick says, "Okay, I make a point of meeting all these conditions." 5 days before my trial, on November 18, 2020, I find myself released on bail with a curfew from 10 o'clock in the evening until 7 o'clock in the morning. But during the day, I can attend my hearings and the rest of the time go prepare for my trial. And so that's how my release goes, the famous November 18, 2020. So I spent the next 5 months from November 2020 to April 2021 free on bail. When I attended the hearings, and there were many, so it was a marathon trial, 4 months, I went to the hearings free. That is, I went to the court and sat in the courtroom like any public except on the day of the verdict. So on the last day of the trial, I arrive free, and then the policeman on duty tells me, "Matthias, I'm sorry, but today, it's the day of the verdict. So if the verdict is negative, we will have to reincarcerate you. So you go into the dock behind the glass, and then we wait for the verdict. And that is horrible. That's horrible because we don't know what's happening behind. Well, if we know the 2 scenarios, I know them. And if the scenario is I'm declared guilty behind the glass, Then the police come to get me, handcuff me, take me to the basement, and then I wait for the prison van, and I go back to prison, and it's terrible. It's a monstrous prospect. But that's not what happened. He made this judgment after a month of reflection and thought, a month between the last hearing of the trial and the acquitted verdict. He took his time and wrote something extremely detailed. What he essentially said is that nothing was ever hidden and no amount of money was misused. And that all the money my sponsors had sent me were used appropriately and justified, including all the bribes. And it turns out that during the 4 months of the trial, I showed from A to Z how all the money had been used and how I had explained at each step, so with my monthly reports, among other things, to my sponsors, how I would use this money. In analyzing this whole story in hindsight, I think these billionaires, especially these two people, at one point considered that they had lost face, that I had made them lose face. And that justifies all the excesses, all the violence, and it's not at all a question of amount, it's not at all a question of money. But when I have to give advice about this story, when you find yourself facing opponents like that, who do not hesitate to hit below the belt, who do not hesitate to abuse their power, do not let yourself be dragged into their amorality, it's mainly about keeping your own morality and keeping this line of conduct where you believe that what you're doing is the right thing.